You've been listening to Donald J. Trump giving a major economic policy plan in Detroit, Michigan to supporters there at the Economic Club. What was interesting in this speech is that Mr. Trump had a number of protesters. They were taken out of the venue there, but he did not react to them except for one time when he sort of made a joke. But you didn't see the typical, get him out that we have seen in the past. But he laid out his economic plan, saying that he was obviously going to put America back to work again. Let's get into this. First of all, let me introduce myself. I'm Vladimir Zutit. Thanks so much for joining us right here on CBSN. With me also is CBSN political contributor and Democratic strategist Linda Tran. In L.A., CBSN political contributor and Republican strategist Leslie Sanchez. And in Washington, economist for the Center for American Progress, David Midland. David, because this was an economic speech, let's go to you first. What did you make of the policy plans that Mr. Trump laid out?
Well, I thought the policy plans were largely a continuation of trickle-down economics. Cut taxes for the rich, deregulate banking and other industries, and hope that benefits are going to fall on everyone else. So as a policy matter, I thought it was, largely more of the same that we've been hearing from Republicans for decades. There were a few different tweaks, and the biggest tweak was really in the language and how he talked about it, and that he talked about this was going to help workers. This was really a sort of a worker-centric plan. When you contrast that with sort of how Mitt Romney talked, makers and takers, that was a bit, that's a big, big difference. But largely the policy, with a few exceptions, is more of the same.
So, David, let's try to fact check some of the things that Mr. Trump was talking about on the fly. You obviously have this background in economics. I spent a couple of years on Wall Street. So Trump has been, over the last couple of weeks, talking about NAFTA, saying how that was such a disaster for the United States. It seems to me that the economic theory on that is more neutral. It wasn't terrible the way Ross Perot said it was going to be, and it wasn't the fix-all that Bill Clinton said it was going to be back in 1992. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, I think your read is exactly right. The research will show that there was a slight boost to our GDP, so more goods and services that we're producing, but some slight impact on things like wages, especially in sort of hard-hit areas. So some impact, but by far nowhere near the big deal that he's trying to claim it is.
And before we go to the politics section of this, David, he is right. Donald Trump is correct when he talks about the loss of manufacturing jobs. Before NAFTA was enacted, we had some 17 million manufacturing jobs in the United States. Since NAFTA, in the 20 years since NAFTA, from 93 to 2013, we were down to about 12 million manufacturing jobs. But is that solely due to NAFTA, or is it because a lot of corporations decided that it made better sense for them to take those jobs overseas?
Due to both of those factors, and also especially technological change. We've just, manufacturing plants are much more efficient, and they can do more even in the United States with fewer people, robots, et cetera. And so, NAFTA is a part of that story, but it's just not the whole story. It's also globalization at large, corporate strategies, and technological change.
All right, David, stand by. Let's go to Leslie, our Republican strategist on our panel today. Leslie, what did you make of Mr. Trump's speech, and what did you make also of his couple of things? One, that he seemed to exert a lot of control when protesters, and there were a couple in that audience. He didn't say a whole lot about them. And the fact, as David just pointed out, that this is, in essence, a trickle-down economic policy plan, something that we've been hearing from Republicans for quite some time.
Well, first, Vlad, I want to start with that trickle-down comment, because that's the same kind of voodoo economics that the Democrats and the left have tried to say going back to Reagan and before that. And to pull a piece from Reagan, Reagan was saying, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago, with his 1984 campaign speech. And if you look at the Barack Obama impact on the economy, you have to say no. Less than 3% GDP growth, 11 million more people on food stamps, 7 million more people in poverty, middle class is shrinking, and if you account for inflated adjusted terms, they're making much less money now than they were in the last 15 years. So I think Donald Trump certainly has a runway to make an economic argument, and he started to do it. Unfortunately, it was the last half of the speech. You had to really sit around for a long time past the protesters to hear it. But fundamentally, he has a good comparison and contrast, reducing marginal tax rates, reducing corporate marginal tax rate. He's talking about trade and the issue of bringing automotive jobs back. I think he could have gotten more into that. And that really should have been where he started. But it's at least moving pushing the direction of this economic conversation and this comparison and contrast with Hillary in the right direction.
All right, Leslie, stand by just one moment. Linda as well, David as well. I want to go to Major Garrett. He was in that speech there in Detroit, Michigan. He was watching as some of those protesters were taken out. And also, Major, just wanted to have you talk a little bit about Trump on teleprompter, a very different Trump than the one that we normally see at rallies.
Sure, let's just start on the basics. The Trump campaign is very relieved to have any conversation in this country about policy and where Trump might take the country if he's elected president, because that spares them the agony of conversations like they lived through last week. Fights with the party, fights with Trump and his advisors, a sense of malaise or disarray within the campaign. So this is part of a week devoted to trying to reset the campaign itself and stabilize things after a disastrous week last week. So, a policy conversation the Trump campaign will take, even a negative one, or one that's at least half negative and half positive. And the most important policy aspect of Donald Trump's speech, if you look at it in terms of politics and tactics, is changing his tax reform plan. When he introduced it back in September, it was 4 tax brackets. Now it's 3, aligned much more closely with Paul Ryan and House Republicans' vision of tax reform. Why is that important politically and tactically? Because it takes Donald Trump's pride of authorship away from his tax plan and gives it to House Republicans and the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, who I don't need to remind our audience, Trump and Ryan have feuded with each other publicly and privately, and last week had a big blow up that was part of the disastrous week. This is a conscious effort on Trump's part to get himself closer to Paul Ryan and the House Republicans, because if he is elected, he now has a tax reform plan that every House Republican, or nearly every House Republican, has signed off on and is ready to bring to the House floor and move rapidly. So that is a policy concession on Trump. It is giving credit to House Republicans, putting them in charge of tax reform, taking himself out of it, and for the first time speaking much more directly about working with House Republicans to get this process started if he's elected president. Now, in the grand scheme of things, most Americans might say, well, that all sounds like kind of in the weeds, nerd stuff. It's not. If you're talking about tax policy and you're picking sides, Trump has sided with House Republicans. And within this Republican Party conversation, both on the specifics of tax reform and whose side are you on, Trump has sided with House Republicans, which is not where he was a week ago. I just talked to one of Trump's economic advisors, Larry Kudlow. He said we made significant changes to this even on the plane out here. So this might have been a very last-minute assessment on Trump's part. They need to get closer to House Republicans. The fact that he has will be noticed by those within the party and those in the economic policy community evaluating the speech and the tactics behind it.
And Major, when you saw some of those protesters, did they appear to be separate, or were they sort of a group of people that got in there together, or were they just individuals on their own deciding to do this?
Well, you can never be sure, but it certainly looked as if there was a very well-constructed plan. I believe the final count was 14. 12 at least were women. I think might have been 13 women and 1 man. And the whole setup, it felt like, was one at a time, to be as disruptive as possible throughout the speech. And I, for one, can't tell you, Vlad, what any of them were saying, except there are reporters whom I trust who heard the last guy, the only guy, and what he was shouting was somewhat interesting in a political context. It wasn't anything about policy or Trump's rhetoric. He just kept saying tiny hands.
All right, Major Garrett reporting from Detroit for us. Major, thanks so much for your time. We appreciate it, as always.
Sure.
Let's get back into it with our panel. Linda, let's jump off from where Leslie left us, which is talking about some of the things that economically have happened in the United States, where you have more people on food stamps, you have more people suffering job loss, wages have gone down. On the other hand, if I look at the 2012 platform that Mitt Romney was talking about when he was running for president, some of the things that he advocated, including bringing unemployment down below 5%. Then it was 8%. Under President Obama, unemployment has come down to below 5%. Newt Gingrich and Sarah Palin have talked about bringing gas to below 250. We're there now, and there are a number of others. So on one hand, some things have gotten worse, and on the other hand, some of the things that Republicans themselves campaigned for back in 2012 have come to fruition under the Obama administration.
Yeah, and if you take it back even a little bit further, you have to remember that when Barack Obama took office, we were hemorrhaging 800,000 jobs a month, and unemployment was double what it is now. So there's no question that there's been some tremendous progress under this president. So it's kind of interesting that that is his line of attack. The other thing that's fascinating is already, although he's just delivered his speech, there have been analyses out this morning about what the implications really would be of some of the measures he's calling for, like repealing the estate tax, which really not only benefit the top 1%, but actually are benefiting the top tenth of 1%. And so while he's talking in a tone that really harkens to the working people and trying to resonate with them when he says, you know, bring back American steel, the reality is some of the very measures that he's proposing today really benefit the top of the top.
And well, Leslie, that is a criticism that some people have had of Donald Trump, given that we've seen in the last couple of years this movement towards a more libertarian strain in both parties, both Democrats and Republicans, that this idea that you're going to cut taxes that are going to benefit the top 1% or cut taxes that will benefit corporations and not necessarily the middle class is something that people have said is perhaps hasn't worked in the past.
I agree with you, Vlad, but I think particularly on the issue of the death tax and the estate tax, it's an issue I've worked on for over 10 years, particularly how it affects communities of color, small businesses that are trying to build wealth. It is not these big Walmart families and Mars that pay those estate death taxes. It's the small businesses that have manufacturing warehouses and canned goods and things, and they're trying to move those operations, and somebody in that family passes away, and all the wealth of that family, it's up to 70%, is gone. So I think you are talking about moving middle-class families up the economic rung when you talk about those things. And what is key about that speech is he's going to compare himself to the plans of Hillary Clinton, who promised 200,000 jobs. He mentioned that. They never came to fruition. And also, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, jobs actually decreased in upstate New York. So they've got now a healthy economic debate to get started.
David, let me ask you before we wrap this up, what is the responsibility of, because we've been talking about the corporate sector, with regards to the state of the economy? In other words, the idea, and this is something President Obama recently said, the idea that these manufacturing jobs are coming back, or that you could, you know, graduate from high school and get a great job working for a company like IBM in the old days, or ITT, is just not reality today. And so there needs to be more emphasis placed on education, more emphasis placed on training people here, as opposed to this idea of trying to create jobs in the plan that Mr. Trump has laid out this way.
Well, I think, you know, to get where we need to go, it's certainly, you talk about education. We clearly need to have you know, education plan to compete globally. We also need to raise our standards internally, things like the minimum wage, so that work pays a living wage. You also then, I think, you talked about sort of what's the role of the corporation. You want, I think, some cultural change where a corporation sees itself as not just fighting for its shareholders, but also working for its workers and the larger community. And that is how corporations in the United States several years ago used to think, but increasingly they've had a much more short-term result, which is not only bad for the workers and the community, but really it's also bad for the long-term growth of the country. So we also need to be thinking about how we get corporations thinking long-term again.
All right, David Madlin there with his comments on the economy. We appreciate it, sir. And as always, Leslie Sanchez and Linda Tran, thank you both for your insights. We appreciate it.